Let's pick up where we left off. Last time we talked about how Turkey tried for decades to join the European Union and got strung along, ghosted, and ultimately snubbed. In response, Turkey pivoted. Under Erdoğan, it turned east, leaned into nationalism, and started throwing its weight around the Middle East. But here's where it gets interesting. The same Europe that kept Turkey at arm's length ended up needing it more than ever. In 2011, Syria exploded. A peaceful protest movement spiraled into one of the most brutal civil wars in modern history. Bashar al-Assad's regime cracked down, hard. Cities were bombed into dust. Rebel factions formed, splintered, regrouped. Jihadists surged in from across the region. Chaos reigned. And sitting right next door, Turkey. Watching the whole thing unfold, realising it had a front row seat to a disaster, and maybe a role to play in how it ended. At first, Turkey took the diplomatic route. Erdoğan publicly urged Assad to reform, to listen to his people. But when Assad chose tanks and barrel bombs instead of ballots, Erdoğan made a call. Turkey would back the Syrian opposition. Now that move wasn't totally unique. The US, the EU, Gulf countries all backed rebel groups at various points. But Turkey went further. It opened its borders. It hosted opposition leaders. It let weapons flow through. It supported armed groups. And eventually, it launched military operations on Syrian soil. This wasn't just diplomacy, this was intervention. At the same time, Turkey faced a massive wave of humanity crashing across its southern border. Millions of Syrians, families, children, students, workers, were fleeing the war. And they didn't head for Berlin or Paris. They went to Turkey. By 2015, Turkey was hosting over 3 million Syrian refugees, more than any country in the world. Schools were overwhelmed, camps were built, entire towns shifted overnight. At first, Europe praised Turkey. Look at Erdoğan, they said. He's doing the heavy lifting, a responsible partner. But then the refugees kept coming, and they started crossing into Europe. Tens of thousands arrived in Greece, then through the Balkans, then into Austria, Hungary, Germany. The headlines were relentless. Photos of drowned children, overcrowded camps, far-right parties screaming about invasion. Angela Merkel made the bold and controversial choice to keep Germany's doors open, but not everyone in Europe agreed. Panic set in, borders went back up, political parties collapsed, and suddenly the EU was looking for a way to stop the flow. In 2016, Europe struck a deal with Erdoğan. Keep the refugees in Turkey. In return, we'll give you billions in aid. We'll restart EU membership talks. Maybe even speed up visa liberalisation for Turkish citizens. On paper, it was a partnership. In reality, it was a bribe. A very expensive bribe. Turkey agreed, for now. But Erdoğan isn't the type to let a good bargaining chip go to waste. Every time the EU criticised him, over press freedom, over purging judges, over jailing political opponents, he hit back with the same threat. I'll open the gates. In 2019, he said it flat out. If you go any further, we will open the gates and send 3.6 million refugees your way. Europe took him seriously, because they knew he could do it. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. The EU, which once saw Turkey as the desperate candidate, now found itself on the back foot, dependent on Erdoğan's goodwill to avoid political meltdown at home. Meanwhile, Turkey kept expanding its role in Syria. It carved out territory in the north. It set up buffer zones. It ran schools and police stations in areas technically inside Syria's borders. It didn't overthrow Assad. Russia and Iran made sure of that. But it absolutely shaped the post-war map. If you wanted to get humanitarian aid into northern Syria, you had to go through Turkey. If you wanted to plan for refugee returns, Turkey had a say. If you wanted to contain Kurdish militias, Turkey was calling the shots. Erdoğan turned a war next door into a platform for regional influence. In December 2024, Bashar al-Assad's regime collapsed after a rapid rebel advance into Damascus, ending over 5 decades of Ba'athist rule. Assad fled to Moscow, where he was granted asylum by Russia. In the aftermath, a transitional government led by President Ahmed al-Shara was established, with significant involvement from Islamist factions like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Turkey, having maintained a strong presence in northern Syria throughout the conflict, quickly aligned itself with the new leadership. Ankara has been instrumental in shaping the emerging political order, leveraging its military presence and political ties to influence key appointments and policies. This strategic positioning has allowed Turkey to play a pivotal role in Syria's reconstruction and governance, ensuring that its interests are well represented in the post-Assad era. And here's the part Europe really needs to think about. What if they hadn't rejected Turkey in the first place? What if, back in 2005, or even earlier, they had gone all in on Turkey's membership bid? Picture it. Turkey as part of the EU's political, economic and security architecture. A full partner, sitting in EU foreign policy meetings, sharing intelligence, shaping neighbourhood policy from inside the system. When the Syrian war broke out, Turkey would have been on the inside, not just a neighbour, but a co-decision maker. Instead of striking deals under pressure, the EU could have co-designed its refugee policy with Ankara. Instead of paying billions to a country outside the club, it could have coordinated migration flows from within, even militarily, with Turkey's army integrated more deeply into EU defence planning. The EU might have had a bigger footprint in the Syrian theatre. Not to wage war necessarily, but to deter some of the worst-case scenarios: mass displacement, regional spillover, radicalisation. And geopolitically, the EU would have had far more influence in one of the biggest crises of the 21st century. Instead, they chose the cold shoulder, and when the crisis came, they had to go begging. Now, to be clear, Turkey didn't become perfect in the meantime. Democratic backsliding, media repression, foreign policy adventurism, all real. But imagine if the EU had locked Turkey into its orbit before all of that accelerated. If you want to talk about missed strategic opportunities, this is top of the list. Now here's the kicker. Turkey has recently signalled it wants to reopen EU accession talks, but this time the tone is very different. It's not knocking timidly on Europe's door, it's leaning back in its chair, arms crossed, saying, "We're open to it, but only if you're serious." Erdoğan summed it up perfectly. Turkey is not the old Turkey. If Europe wants us, it must treat us as equals. And let's be honest, he's not bluffing, because Turkey is no longer the awkward candidate. It's a regional power, a NATO heavyweight, a migration gatekeeper, a drone exporter, a player in Libya, in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, and beyond. The EU, on the other hand, is still figuring out what kind of geopolitical actor it wants to be. So the question is no longer, should Europe let Turkey in? It's, what happens if Turkey stops caring altogether? Because sometimes the people you leave behind are the ones who come back with the most leverage.